Greetings, everyone, and welcome back to the Columbia Business School Executive Education Executive Webinar Series. Today, we're going to be discussing best practices in performance leadership, and we're joined by Professor Grant Ackerman. Professor Ackerman is a professor of management at Columbia Business School, and he's the faculty director of the Executive Development Program. His area of research, and he is an expert in teaching the area of executive leadership. So before we begin today, we'll just go through a few housekeeping rules. So a recording will be available after the webinar, so you'll have a way to go back and listen to some of the topics and refamiliarize yourself with the content. For questions, we'll have about 20 minutes of content, and then we'll have a Q&A session. If you could please use the Q&A box there in the Zoom window to submit your questions, and we'll get to those questions after the webinar. And also, while you're listening, please tweet about the webinar using the hashtag CBSExecEd. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Grant Ackerman.
Thank you, Nate, and welcome to everyone joining us for this webinar on best practices in performance leadership. I'll begin with about 20 minutes of presentation and then welcome your questions and comments about some or all of this and how it applies in practical ways in your organizations. During the presentation, we have a number of goals to achieve. First, I'd like to challenge you to consider what performance means to you. Typically, answers to this question stay within the confines of traditional business metrics. Today, I want to challenge you to think differently about the word performance and the consequences that will follow for you and your organization. As we consider what performance means to your success, I'm also going to invite you to think about how you can better align the vision and strategy of your organization with the activities of your frontline employees. Your ability to accomplish this becomes the foundation of performance leadership. In that moment, we also are going to explore in depth the performance review process and how, when done well, it can promote employee engagement. Through all of this, we're going to consider how to create a culture of performance that will serve well both your organizations and your individual career success. And finally, our conversation today will be informed by the results of a survey conducted by our co-sponsor of this webinar, Ivy Exec. Our first question is, what does performance mean to you? When I make this inquiry in our executive education programs, more often than not, the answers follow traditional metrics of business or organizational success. For example, many will say performance means return on investment. Others might say it's about revenues or market share. I'd like to suggest a different way of thinking about performance, one that borrows from paradigms well beyond business or organizational life. I define performance as something worth watching. Think about this in the context of sports. Here in the United States, on any given weekend, during a college or professional football game, what we call football anyway, you have 22 players on the field in desperate need of rest, and 90,000 spectators in the stands in desperate need of exercise. Why is that? Why would those who would benefit the most from exercise pay very good money to watch others engage in physical activity? The answer, because it's a performance worth watching. I can recall years ago when a tennis star named Vitas Gerulaitis won one of the major professional tennis tournaments. They were interviewing his competitors, those over whom he had triumphed, when one of them said, "Today, the rest of us were playing tennis. Vitas was doing something else." A performance worth watching. Think about how that applies to you and your organization. Who in your organization performs in such a way that not only do you admire what they do, you watch them carefully to learn from them? How many of you can say that you aspire to be in that position? How many of you conduct yourselves in such a way that your performance is worth watching? That's one of our goals for today, to begin to explore how you can create within your organization processes and approaches that will lead to a performance worth watching. I mentioned earlier that as a performance leader, one of your most important responsibilities is to align the vision and strategy of your organization with the activities of your frontline employees. This idea was brought home to me when I had the opportunity to visit the headquarters of a very large company that had a global reach. For sake of confidentiality, I'll need to tell the story in general terms. When I arrived at the company, I saw on the walls of its rather expansive lobby a poster that had a combination of words and graphs. As I proceeded upstairs to meet the executive I was there to interview, I saw the same poster on the walls outside the elevators. The same poster was prominently displayed in this executive's office. Now, psychologists will tell you that if I did not ask him about that poster, there was something wrong with me and my ability to read contextual clues. So I asked, and the executive proceeded to tell me that the poster was a product of a retreat the entire senior management team had gone on some months earlier. At that retreat, the executives created a mission statement for their organization. You can see it on this slide. Look at its lofty goals. We put safety and security first. We will provide rewarding and enjoyable careers. We will be totally customer driven. We accept responsibility towards the environment. We will be the best company in our industry of the decade. We will produce superior financial returns. We are committed to the communities we serve. At the end of the retreat, after the executives assembled were quite satisfied with the statement they had created and satisfied with themselves, the CEO turned the podium over to the executive who was telling me this story. The executive advised everyone at the retreat that their homework assignment was to create metrics that would measure whether they were accomplishing the goals set forth in this statement. For example, the statement says that they put safety and security first. Well, how would they know if they were doing that? For example, what would be a measure that would tell them whether they were putting safety and security first? You may begin to reflect on what metrics you might come up with if you were given the same assignment. How would you measure whether a company is totally customer driven? Executives at this company not only came up with a measure for each of the lofty goals you see on the screen, they kept track of their performance month in and month out and published the results on a poster that was visible throughout the entire organization. With those performance metrics in front of their workforce on a daily basis, each employee was challenged to consider how their activities were contributing to the effort to achieve those goals. We might now take a look at the survey results to consider the role of such statements in your organizations. I should indicate that not everyone has completed this survey. This was done through Ivy Exec, and it is information that is helpful for us in this particular context to illuminate what's occurring in your organizations. One of the survey questions asks whether your organization, meaning all of the respondents in the survey, whether your organization had any of the following: a mission statement, a vision statement, a value statement, a strategy statement. As you can see the results, on average, only about 2/3 of respondents were confident that their organization had a mission, vision, or value statement. And the number was even less for a strategy statement, which may be the most important statement of all. The next slide is even more telling. It shows the number of those answering yes, that they had one or more of those statements. It shows the numbers who could actually recite or paraphrase the statement. On average, only 38% could in some way articulate the content of those statements. When that percentage is calculated for the total number of respondents in the survey, that was a total of 390 participating in the survey, on average, only about 22% of respondents could write in a meaningful way about their organization's mission, vision, or values, and the number was again lower for strategic plans. This brings to mind that idea of a clear line of sight. Our strategy faculty talk about having a clear line of sight between the C-suite and the activities of the frontline employees who ultimately have to make good on the promises of the decisions that are made in the C-suite. If employees don't understand what the goals of the organization are, its missions, its values, its strategies, How can they effectively execute on those decisions? The examples I'm sharing today illustrate the challenges and opportunities of making sure everyone in your organization understands what you are trying to accomplish. This applies whether you define your organization as the entire company or your individual unit. If you commit to creating a performance worth watching and then develop performance metrics that hold you and others accountable to accomplishing strategic goals, and if you're willing to be transparent about your success as well as your setbacks on these goals, you will be well on your way to employee engagement that is meaningful and effective. But performance leadership does not stop there. Once employees in your organization understand what your goals are and how those goals will be measured, a performance review process should provide them with feedback about how well they are doing at the individual level in order to achieve those goals. Our survey results show that the vast majority of respondents have a formal review process in their organization, most of which are done on an annual basis. The next slide is the most telling, though. When asked how satisfied respondents were with their formal review process, the average score was approximately 3.0. That's on a 5-point scale, with 5 indicating very satisfied. Only about 1/3 of participants gave a score of 4 or 5, with 2/3 indicating that they were somewhere between neutral or not satisfied at all with the formal review process. When asked about the opinions of others in their organization, the results were similar. The average score was just above 3.0, with 70% of respondents suggesting that others in their organization were either tolerant, negative, or very negative about the formal review process. If performance feedback is critical to achieving organizational goals, and it is, why are performance review processes so unpopular? More often than not, it's because of the way they're executed. Earlier, we indicated that the vast majority of formal reviews are done on an annual basis. That has been part of the problem. Such a process creates a pressured bottleneck that has more to do with obligation than meaning. Sometimes the problem is content. The questions or topics or the subject of review are not focused on strategic goals. They can be too general. Keep in mind that we just discussed how aligning organizational strategies with frontline behaviors are key to performance leadership. The next time you visit your individual performance review documents, ask yourself whether the behaviors that are identified in them align with the overall strategic goals of your organization. Other times, the challenges of performance review has to do with the process itself. Recall that most organizations do an annual performance review. That's not the problem in and of itself. The challenge is what occurs during the rest of the year. When finally comes that formal annual review meeting, there should be no surprises. For that to happen, there should be a constant dialogue throughout the year, conversations that help individuals understand what they're doing well and when they can improve. That's an informal feedback process. In our survey, when asked how often respondents received informal feedback from those that they work with, the average response was again around a 3.0, which means sometimes. As you can see in this slide, only about 30% of respondents indicated that they received this kind of informal feedback from their boss, either often or all the time. Interestingly, when it came to giving informal feedback to direct reports, respondents in the survey indicated that they did that more often, with an average score of 4.14, and that would indicate that they did this often. That's good news for both your direct reports as well as yourself as a performance leader. By giving feedback on a regular basis, even informally, you're creating a culture of performance, one that is feedback rich and welcomes the opportunity to improve. Creating a culture of performance takes both time and a value system that welcomes candid and constructive feedback. In our survey, we also asked how many organizations had a formal after-action review process. Such a process normalizes the idea of giving and receiving feedback after specific events and is heavily relied upon in organizations where performance really matters, from the military to making movies. If you ever talk with an actor after they've gone to an audition, he or she may tell you about the notes they received, if they've been lucky enough to get them. After an audition, casting directors and others often give specific feedback about how well the actor did in the audition. These are called notes. Actors will consider themselves lucky to get these notes because not every casting director or movie director is willing to take the time to do this. If the directors do make the effort, the feedback is invaluable to the actor, and this is separate from whether they actually get that part. Talk about a feedback-rich environment. Each audition, actors place themselves and their livelihood on the line, making themselves vulnerable, egos included. Through it all, they welcome constant feedback, all in an effort to improve their performance. Our survey indicated, though, that only about 32% of respondents' organizations had a formal process for evaluating an event or an activity after it was completing. Creating a formal after-action review process in your organization can be important for two reasons. Not only might it help improve the specific activity under review, it also will normalize the idea in your organization that welcome, candid, and constructive feedback is always a part of continuous improvement. That brings us to another important element of creating a culture of performance: giving feedback in a way that actually gets through to the target audience. This illustration that you see is the classic Johari window, which shows the need to open oneself to discover that which is unknown to you but known to others. Such an openness requires a commitment to continuous learning, something that you'll want to cultivate in your organization. It also requires the capacity to give feedback in a constructive way, a capacity you'll want to cultivate in yourself. The illustration that you see now offers examples of different approaches to giving feedback and the challenges that occur with a wrong focus. The framework distinguishes between a concern for self and a concern for the other person. If you're only concerned about yourself and not the feelings of the other person, you become a bully. At the other end of the spectrum, if you are too concerned about the feelings of the other person and not yourself or the good of your organization, you become a bit of a doormat. If you're not concerned about yourself, the good of the organization, or the other person, you're likely simply going to avoid conflict, and that eventually will provide unfortunate consequence for everyone involved. The ideal in all of this is to demonstrate a genuine concern for the other person while simultaneously protecting and promoting your interests and the interests of your organization. When you do that, you will be able to continue with an integrated and assertive approach to giving feedback, one that is effective for both you and the recipient of the information. I could go into more details about all of this, including giving and receiving constructive feedback, as well as any of the other topics that I've introduced so far. For now, though, I think I'll stop here and invite questions and comments on the topics we've already explored and others. I can use those then as a point of departure to go into more detail as time and interests allow. So with that, I know Nate has been observing and understanding what questions might have been offered so far, and so I'll invite him to give us a review of some of the things that we might go into more detail about.
Yes, and thank you so much for that, Professor Ackerman. We have a few questions coming in, and I would just remind everyone listening in to please use the Q&A box to submit any questions. And our first question here comes from Sharon Kamal. He says, can you comment on your view of why organizations have begun to abandon traditional formal performance reviews, but without a clear understanding of the path forward?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I can comment on why they're abandoning it. I think the most compelling part of the question has to do with not understanding what the clear path forward is. And I'll suggest this. The trend line is for companies to be cautious now about annual performance reviews. and some are actually abandoning them. My sense is that it's likely a headline that doesn't really reflect the reality of what's occurring in those organizations. And it's consistent with what I shared earlier in terms of the dissatisfaction with the formal review process. But I'll use a metaphor: don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, there is an extremely important rationale for giving constant feedback in an organization. It's so people can learn about themselves, learn about others, learn about their activities, and then improve. And that's been the theme, hopefully, that's come through in this webinar on performance leadership. The challenge has been that the annual review process in its formal form has not accomplished that goal. As I mentioned earlier, it becomes a bottleneck. There's a lot of pressure. It becomes more of a ritual instead of actually encouraging learning. So in that moment of any company trying to decide what would be a better option than their formal review process, I would encourage them to go to the core of its purpose. One, have the norm in the company offer a value of continuous feedback. And so that taking notes or giving notes after each meeting is a wonderful way of just normalizing the idea that we can help each other improve what we do, not unlike what actors do after an audition. That kind of continuous feedback is going to be the most important. I would suggest, though, that a formal review process is still appropriate for a host of different issues. Sometimes informal conversations don't get the message across. It's not inappropriate to have a specific time when there is a more formal conversation and it's documented, and specific goals can be identified, development goals as well as business goals. So I would not eliminate completely the formal review process. If anything, I would increase the frequency of it, maybe do it twice a year, just so that people have ongoing feedback, and perhaps emphasize more the informal conversations rather than any formal meeting as critical to the success of the organization.
Okay, thank you very much. We have another question coming in here from Sergio. He says, how do you get voluntary engagement?
Well, there's another term, engagement, that is quite popular now. And engagement can have a number of different dimensions to it, ranging anywhere from behavioral aspects, that someone is giving their full effort while they're at work, emotional dimensions, are they passionate, are they excited about their work, and mindset, are they in the zone when they're at work, are they absorbed by it, or do they look for opportunities to be distracted? Engagement is the key. The challenge is how do you evoke that kind of behavior, that kind of attitude from individuals? It's a deeply layered question. There's a lot of variables that are going to contribute to that, but let me tie it in with what we've covered already today. In order for someone to engage in a way that their behaviors are going to be helpful for the organization, they have to understand where they fit, how what they're doing on a daily basis is contributing to the overall mission and strategy of the organization. And so aligning then those mission statements, vision statements, strategy statements with performance reviews and specific behaviors that the person would be given feedback about is a way for them to find meaning in what they're doing. The hope is that in addition to them understanding how they can contribute, they also have the skills and abilities to contribute. That oftentimes is a matter of training. One of the greatest frustrations for everyone is when there is an employee that really would like to contribute, would like to engage, but does not have the capacity to do that. The task then is to equip them with the ability, whether that's through formal educational processes or informal learning, including observing others who are doing it well because they have a performance that's worth watching. In all of that, then, if the employee has selected the right field for them, the right career path, if they enjoy what they do and they're passionate about it, and they also understand how what they're doing is contributing to the overall mission of their organization, you're likely going to have employees that are happier, more engaged, and are really excited about what they do. That's on your best day.
All right, thank you so much. And we have another question coming in from Heather Newton, and she asks, are there any pitfalls or awareness issues with launching a formal 360-degree performance assessment in an organization that has kept performance reviews largely one-directional?
Well, yes, there are pitfalls specifically to 360s, and I'll give you some general ideas about it. One, it does reach back to our discussion of creating a culture of performance and how the 360 is introduced. If this is something new to the organization, it would be a great help to introduce it in such a way in a process that gets everybody comfortable with the idea of continuous feedback. And that includes subordinates giving feedback to their bosses. If the communication has only been one way so far, I will predict it's been one way from the top down. So normalizing the idea that subordinates are able to give feedback to their bosses is the first idea. And that's a challenge at both levels, not only to have the manager be open to getting feedback from subordinates, but also having subordinates feel comfortable that they can give that feedback and not be penalized for it. That's why confidentiality is quite important in a 360. There has to be a sufficient number of subordinates who can contribute to the 360 feedback that it may be difficult for a manager to understand exactly who said what. So confidentiality is the key. There's also an issue in terms of how the 360 is used. I oftentimes encourage it to be used as a developmental goal, not an evaluative goal for the particular employee. What I mean by that is 360 reviews would not necessarily be used to evaluate the employee as part of their annual performance review. The reason that I suggest that is that sometimes people can use a 360 for the wrong purposes. And if it is a part of a formal review, it can actually hurt the employee in a way that's inappropriate. If it's used as a developmental tool, you have the same risk, but not the same consequence. If somebody has completed the 360 on another and they've done it with an ulterior motive, hopefully it's transparent, given the rest of the data that's in opposite to what one person may be saying, but also can be taken in context for purposes of developing that particular employee. When a 360 is used as a development tool, the information is shared with that individual, and perhaps no one else. Sometimes organizations will permit that person's boss to see the 360, but that can be an exception, not the rule. The idea is candid communication that's confidential, that an employee can receive from a number of different constituents, and with that information, improve themselves, create an individual development plan so that they can continue to improve. We do the 360 in our executive development program, and what we encourage is for the individual to take a look at patterns, trends. So if you have on the same question a very high score from all parties, from your boss to your peers to your subordinates, you ought to take that to heart. It's something that you're doing well, and people are recognizing that. And similarly, if you have a low score on the same question or in the same area from your boss and subordinates and perhaps your peers, you're getting a consistent signal that this is something that you have to work on. And so it's looking for patterns, it's understanding it in context, and then with that, using all of that to create an individual development plan that'll help you continue in your learning in both formal activities as well as informal learning opportunities.
All right, and I think we have time for one more question here. It's in the context of global multinational organizations, what impact do cultural differences have on the basic principles you spoke about today?
That is a very important question, and one that we should do a follow-up webinar on because the cross-cultural differences in not only management but communications creates an entire another set of variables that have to be factored in when you're creating performance reviews. So I often indicate in our programs that some of the concepts that are presented are culturally bound. They'll be appropriate in one context, but always have to be made relevant in another cultural context. And that culture, I might emphasize, applies not only to differences between countries, but differences between organizations. So, for example, the norms and values of a startup in the Silicon Valley may be very different than the norms and values of an established organization in heavy industry, even right here in the US. So one, you have to understand the norms and values. One of the critical elements of cultural differences, the idea of power distance. I mention that only because it ties into our last question about 360s. In high power distance cultures, there is a certain distance between boss and subordinates. And with that, there has to be a sensitivity to what the protocols are, what the customs are with regard to giving and receiving feedback. Sometimes a subordinate would not be comfortable giving or receiving feedback in a more informal way with their boss, just because of cultural norms that surround that. So being culturally sensitive to different cultural dimensions, including power distance and beyond, key variable. There's a lot more to that story. We do an entire session on that, on cross-cultural management and beyond in our programs. But it's a great question and something to be mindful of as you are thinking about how to create a performance review process and a culture of performance in your organization.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for questions today. I want to thank you again, Professor Ackerman, for joining us and sharing your insights and learnings with us today. And I want to mention here that a recording of this webinar will be available later on, so you'll have access to that. And I just want to thank everyone again as well for joining us today.
Thank you, Nate. I've enjoyed the time, and I hope everyone has enjoyed the time also, and we look forward to hearing from you and continuing our discussion in some way.
Great. Thank you so much. See everyone next time.